lätt fria det till fagern nersven. Hon hade en falskeliger tona. Herr Manneli, drog loven i mig. För det jag bjöder så gärna. I könen del såra endast ja eller nej. Om ni vill igen eller ej.
You think medieval swordmasters were mystical, untouchable legends that can win every sword fight ever? Completely wrong. The real Gigachad of Longsword wasn't some kind of mystical legend. He wasn't even perfect. He trained for more than 40 years. He suffered through all of it, and he still said that he wasn't a complete master after all of this. His name was Fiore dei Liberi, and most of you guys misunderstand him. If you don't know me, hi, I'm Michael Kozint, and I've been training Longsword for more than 2 years, sparring and competing in historical European martial arts. And now I'll help beginners to start their own sword fighting journey with structure and without much gear in the first place. Of course, instead of just watching sword content on YouTube. And today we'll talk about one of the most influential European martial artists ever, who had a great influence on the longsword practice that we have today, and why he wasn't some kind of master of all of the things that pop culture nowadays usually tries to represent some kind of master in their media. So who is Fiore? His full name is Fiore Furlano dei Liberi de Cividale di Austria. So he was an active 14th century knight, diplomat, mercenary, and a fencing master. And he wrote one of the most influential works, which is called Fior di Battaglia. In Italian means flower of battle. But here's the thing, he didn't wrote just about the longsword. He wrote a complete combat system. So what he actually fought in his work? Most people here get humbled very quickly. First thing is your structure, your stance, the turns and the steps that you can take before you even grab a longsword in the first place. Then he talks about grappling, so wrestling also. Then it's dagger versus sword. Then the next thing is the baton. Then comes the sword section, but one-handed. Then sword in two hands, so the whole core value that today modern himaists, so longsword fencers, use in actual sparring sense. So the actual techniques that we come to use today. Then he gets to how to fight with a sword in armor, then it's axe in armor, then it's spear, then it's spear in armor, also spear versus other weapons, and also mixed weapons as well, such as even sticks. And on top of that, he also mentions mounted horseback combat with armor and without it. So Fiore, to be precise, he wasn't just a longsword nerd, because Fior di Battaglia that he wrote was a complete martial system based on his experience. And most of all, he understood that combat is entirely contextual. Everything in combat is based on the context. So on different kind of weapons, on different environment, on different ground, with different armor, with different ranges also, and with different tactics on top all of that. And so what connects all of it? It was balance, it was structure, it was your control over the fight, and it was your leverage. So basically, Fiore haven't talked about some kind of spinning nonsense that you can observe in modern media today, which of course includes swords. And then comes his legendary longsword in two hands section, but not how you think. Yes, this section is completely legendary. It teaches us how to behave with a sword, how to control it, how to counter our opponent's counter by countering his counter, and etc. He also shows us the wide play, so gioco largo, then the narrow play, so gioco stretto. Then of course comes a counter to a counter, so techniques versus then counter, who counters a counter, and so much more. and of course the structured systemization of everything. But here what people completely misunderstand. Fiore didn't create an Italian style of fighting with longsword. He just organized principles into his work, and that's entirely different from what we think. So basically, Fiore wasn't this type of man to say, here's 500 techniques that you can use to win in this specific instance, in this specific time when your opponent is here. No, not entirely that. He was teaching us to understand our measure, so our distance. He was trying to teach us how to use our leverage. He was trying to teach us to understand timing and how to understand pressure. And everything else that he mentions inside of this work is just an extension to the principles. So advanced techniques are just a small variations that you base on your foundation. And that's something that modern fencers hate to hear, because that's not sexy at all. There's also the quote from Fiore that destroys our modern fantasy of sword fighting. Now, here's the part that separates Fiore from keyboard warriors. So after more than 30 years of actually studying and doing combat, he wrote this. Now I, Fiore, although I can read and write and draw, and although I have books about this art and have studied it for 30 years and more, do not myself claim to be a perfect master in this art. Let that sink in. 30 years, guys, and he still says that he's not perfect. He continues. If instead of studying the art of armed combat for 40 years, I had spent 30 years studying law, papal decrees, and medicine, then I would be ranked a doctor in all three. In order to study the science of arms, I have endured great hardship, expended great effort, and incurred great expense. Guys, that's not romantic. That's just brutal honesty behind all of this. That's a true and brave man who sacrificed his money, his time, and his health for this, for real skill. That was a short break, sorry for that. So what was the real Gigachad move from Fiore? That's basically that he wasn't inventing some flashy new strikes. No, none of that. It was actually this. Training religiously for decades, then testing everything on his own skin, then also systemizing it. And the last thing is still remaining a student at the very end. Fiore didn't claim some kind of divine mastery over the sword. He actually claimed experience. He claimed a real effort put into this. And that's the real part of modern sword culture that it likes to ignore. So what is the modern misinterpretation? People nowadays think the weirder the technique, the better it is. But we both know that's a complete lie. Even Fiore's integrated deep counter system that he presents to us in his Fiore di Battaglia collapses back into controlling the center line to your opponent. So always being prepared to threaten your opponent with your blade in front of you, which points roughly to your opponent rather than like at the back. Also, he shows us of closing the line safely while reducing the distance to the threat. Also, how to exploit opponent's structure against him. And one of the most important things is actually how to finish quickly and efficiently. So simplicity always wins sword fights. Structure always wins. Not complexity. At least not always. Yes, of course, Fiore himself shows us very weird integrate plays with our longsword that we can do to actually hit our opponent, right? But they are just only logical extensions of what we learn in longsword, not some kind of magic. So context matters. Back in the day when Fiore wrote his work, longswords in general were kinda shorter than our today's feather swords. So our tournament longswords or for sparring, right? Usually in Poland, most of the people who train longsword, they also have the feather sword, which has the maximum length of 135 centimeters to still be able to take part in tournaments with that kind of longsword, right? So 135 centimeters is kind of huge. But in the late 14th century and at the start of the 15th century, you had shorter blades, shorter longsword, like this one. So this specific feather sword is on the shorter side comparing to today's feather swords. It has 125 centimeters, and longswords usually weren't longer than this one. So it was usually the maximum thing that historical weaponsmiths could do with their resources. And that's why Fiore mentions a lot of grappling in his work, because blades were shorter, and the context behind it is that you can actually go near your opponent more often than not than today. This is why he gets into the narrow play as well, so gioco stretto. And so the armor also changes context drastically, and that's why Fiore adapted based on the context of the fight. And that's why I really value his work, because he's intelligent in what he's doing. He, like every one of his techniques, is based on the realism of his times. And that's why his work still matters today for our modern longsword fight. Not because his work is just old, no, it's because it's actually grounded in a real life situations. So what is my personal link to the Fiore's work and he as a person? It wasn't actually me sitting down and memorizing his manuscript line by line. I learned all of that through the second-hand interpretation from my coaches inside of my club, through the actual drilling of the techniques, of actual understanding it in practice rather than just on paper. Then also through the active sparring with that kind of technique, and also through the actual failing in that. Because for me, until words become reality, they stay fake. And this is my personal quote I came up with, and you can use for yourself as well. And Fiore understood that too very well, because theory only matters when it actually survives through the real life pressure, the real life practice of it. So what beginners need to understand is that Fiore isn't a proof that sword fighting is mystical. He's entirely the other thing. He's a proof that fundamentals matter. Grappling also matters in sword fighting. Structure matters, and decades matter in this type of thing. And most importantly, Fiore understood that perfection isn't required to pursue mastery. And actually, it's effort. Effort is. If a 14th century knight, after more than 30 years of studying and constant practice, could still say that he's not perfect, then you, as a beginner, as a total newcomer, you could train 10 minutes a day, and that would be enough for you. And actually, stop pretending that you need to know everything first before you even start doing that. So please, guys, don't romanticize historical masters. I know that I call him a Gigachad, but it's actually based on what he actually tries to teach us. Actually respect the work, respect the real practice of sword fighting that you can do yourself. Train your structure, train your basics, and also earn your understanding of sword fighting. Actually, that's what Fiore would respect in us. So the next step is the most important step for you, because I will tell you where you can actually start to learn from Fiore. So not just reading, but actually configuring his techniques to your real practice. If you're genuinely interested in training basics also with Fiore, then start with the turns and steps. So your foundation and your balance. First things first. So don't start with the flashy counters from his manuscript. Don't start with the counter to a counter to a counter. No, actually start here. His footwork and turns. So first thing, his footwork and the turns of your body. His fencing steps, so accrescere, descrescere. His passing steps. His volta stabile. His actual turns of the body on your feet. Because if you don't understand how to move your body even without a sword, then you will just make it harder for yourself later on. So structure first, because later it will just collapse if you don't train it at the very beginning. Let's imagine the movement is a skeleton and the sword is just an extension. And second thing that you could focus inside of the Fiore's work is gioco largo, so the wide play. Why the wide play, you might ask? Because it teaches us the distance management to our opponent before we step into the actual engagement range. It teaches us how to take the step forward to safely enter into the measure. It teaches us also strong structure. It shows us the clear lines of the attacks and how to move and retreat from our opponent. And it also shows us simpler decision making without even going deep into your opponent in the first place. It's just structurally cleaner for complete beginners. So it builds awareness of your measure, of your timing and your distance management. And it's all before when you even step into the grappling zone with your opponent. And only after that you can explore gioco stretto, so the narrow play of the longsword. Because the narrow play requires of you precise sensitivity and awareness of your opponent's structure, your own movement, the position of your longsword and his longsword, balance and the confidence that beginners don't just have at the very beginning yet. So why this all matters, guys, in the first place? Because most people, also including you, would like to take shortcuts to the blade work right away. You just want to skip ahead because it's more fun to swing your sword and to feel cool rather than training the basics, the foundation that will support you later on in your actual progress. Inside of the Fiore manuscript, you see complex moves, complex counters, and you go, wow, I want to do this right now. And you try to learn this type of movement yourself. But you actually don't understand the logic behind it. The actual secret is the wide measure control. It's your timing to your opponent. It's your pressure, even being out of range, but also stepping into range and knowing how to be prepared to counter your opponent or to exploit his lack of awareness. The secret is structure, and also the secret is to know when to not to enter to your opponent's range. Even Fiore builds outward from the stable foundations before he goes very close to his opponent. So Fiore doesn't throw you into the chaos first. He wants you to learn the logic, the foundations, the principles behind the actual structure of sword fighting first, and then explore these extensions later on, but not right now. He doesn't throw you into that chaos first. He wants you to build you into it. So guys, respect the work, respect the structure, respect the old masters, but don't see them as something divine. Drill the wide play, then earn the narrow play. That's how you actually honor Fiore. Not by just quoting him and feeling like some kind of nerd. No, by actually doing the work that you're supposed to do. By actually moving like a student. And if you made it this far and you want to go deeper with me, with structure, with drills, with the actual advice for beginners that tend to do bad habits along the way, so the actual mindset that you need and real application of skill into the sword fighting, then consider supporting me through the membership of this channel called The Vanguard, and also by joining a free school community, the links in the description, called Start Sword Fighting, where if you join it right now, there is a 100% chance that I will reach out to you inside of this community and actually talk with you one-to-one to help you out on your journey of actually training longsword and applying, configuring it to your real practice of sword fighting. So just join and see for yourself. And remember, always take the initiative.